The Architect of Death, EP1 Frozen in Summer, Crime Story. Outside, the city was melting in a record-breaking heatwave. But inside this luxury apartment, the victim was frozen solid, a statue of ice in a room at 90 degrees. Detective Ethan Thorne has 17 minutes to stop a killer who plays God with the cold. The Ghost of 17 Minutes. July in the city is not for the faint of heart. It's not just the sun, it's the weight of the air. It's the way the concrete skyscrapers soak up the radiation all day and breathe it back out at night like a dying beast. Down on the asphalt, the heat waves shimmer, turning the line of traffic into a distorted, oily mirage. At 2 in the afternoon, the surface temperature hits 120 degrees. The air is thick, gelatinous, a humid shroud that makes every breath feel like a choice. Detective Ethan Thorne pulled his battered sedan to the curb in front of the Zenith. A glass and steel luxury high-rise that looked like a jagged tooth cutting into the purple evening sky. Outside, the industrial-sized AC compressors hummed and rattled on the balconies. A low-frequency growl that sounded like a pack of caged predators. Ethan killed the engine. The heat from the old block bled through his jeans, stinging his shins. He rubbed his eyes. They were a roadmap of broken red veins. He glanced at the dashboard clock, 1914. Not 7:14 in the morning. Evening. He had been awake for 24 hours, 19 of which had been spent buried in a cold case file from 5 years ago. A kidnapping. A failure. 17 minutes. That number circled his mind like a vulture. 17 minutes was the gap between life and a body bag. You're late again, Ethan, he whispered to himself. A bitter, jagged thought that tasted like old coffee and regret. Detective Thorne, over here. The voice belonged to Claire Miller, a young CSI tech who looked like she was melting. Even inside the air-conditioned lobby, she was drenched in sweat. She handed Ethan a pair of blue sterile booties and a fresh surgical mask. Victim is Leanne Vance, 28, Claire said, her voice dropping an octave. She was a contemporary dancer, lead soloist for the city ballet. The housekeeper found her this morning, but we had to lock down the floor for a full technical sweep before we could bring you in. It's strange, Ethan, truly strange. Ethan nodded, his face a mask of weary professionalism. He hated the word, strange. In his world, strange was just a placeholder for logic so cruel it hadn't been decoded yet. The elevator ride to the 22nd floor was silent, the pressure change popping his ears. The scent of expensive lobby perfume mixed with the sterile, metallic tang of the elevator car, a nauseating cocktail. When the doors slid open, a strip of yellow crime scene tape bisected the hallway, a neon warning of the border between the living and the dead. Ethan took a long, stabilizing breath and pushed through the door. A wall of stifling, stagnant heat hit him instantly. The apartment's central air had been cut. The heavy blackout curtains were drawn halfway, allowing the last, angry rays of the setting sun to slash across the hardwood floors. It had to be 95 degrees in there. But as Ethan stepped into the living room, he froze. A jolt of electricity surged down his spine, a primal alarm bell ringing in his marrow. It wasn't fear, it was the sight of something that defied every law of physics and nature. Sitting there, right in the center of the sweltering room, was a masterpiece of the macabre. Ethan didn't move, he just stared. Leanne Vance wasn't slumped over. She wasn't sprawled in the agonizing, undignified posture of a struggle. She sat on the cream-colored velvet sofa with her back perfectly straight. Her legs crossed at the ankles with a dancer's poise. Her head was tilted at a precise, elegant angle, as if she were listening to a symphony only she could hear. She wore a silk slip dress, the color of seafoam, clinging to a frame that was lean and muscular. But it was the frost that stopped Ethan's heart. On her long, dark eyelashes, in the obsidian waves of her hair, and across the smooth expanse of her bare shoulders, a layer of tiny, crystalline ice glinted under the recessed ceiling lights. The frost wasn't melting. In this suffocating, 90-degree room, the girl sat encased in a shimmering coat of diamond dust. She looked less like a corpse and more like a statue carved from a block of winter. "You're 10 minutes late," a voice rasped from the corner. Dr. Harris, the chief medical examiner, stood by a mahogany coffee table, wiping his fogged-up spectacles. Harris was 60, rail-thin, and possessed a gaze that was as clinical and sharp as the scalpels he used to open the truth. The surface temperature of the skin when I arrived was -10 degrees Celsius. Harris said, his voice flat, though Ethan caught the slight tremor in his tone. That means she was flash frozen to a depth far below that before she was placed here. Ethan, to turn a human being into a block of ice in the middle of a July heatwave? This isn't just murder. This is a sick, cold-blooded obsession. Ethan stepped closer. He avoided looking at her face, the pale, translucent skin that looked like fine porcelain, and focused on her hands. The fingers of a dancer, usually supple and expressive, were now as stiff as frozen twigs. Her right hand was curled into a loose fist, as if she were guarding something precious. Ethan pulled on his latex gloves. Very gently, he applied pressure to the frozen fingers. The frost crackled, tiny shards of ice falling to the floor with a sound like breaking glass. Tucked inside her palm was an object. It was a clay cicada. The artifact was a deep, reddish-brown terracotta, fired to a dull sheen. The carving was exquisite. You could see the delicate veining in the wings, the segmented body, the bulging eyes. But as Ethan's gloved fingers brushed the clay, he recoiled. It was warm. An unnatural, pulsing heat radiated through his glove. It wasn't scorching, but it was prominent enough to make his skin crawl. In the dead, frozen hand of a girl who had been turned to ice, this clay insect sat like a glowing ember, holding on to the last scrap of summer. The contrast, the impossible cold and the artificial heat, made Ethan's stomach turn. This wasn't a crime. It was a performance. Is it hot? Harris asked, squinting at the evidence. Warm, Ethan corrected, his voice a low growl, like it just came out of a kiln. Ethan turned the cicada over. On the underside of the belly, where the glaze was thin, a symbol had been etched into the raw clay. It was a series of sharp, deliberate lines, a geometric fragment that looked like half of a broken box. A code? A signature? Suddenly, Ethan was back in that gravel lot 5 years ago. The refrigerated truck, the heavy steel doors he couldn't pry open in time. Cold sweat began to prickle on his forehead, despite the oven-like heat of the apartment. You won't let it happen again, Ethan, he told himself. I'll find you, you son of a bitch, whether you're hiding under the ice or in the furnace. Outside, the sound of real cicadas rose from the parched trees, a shrill, rhythmic screech that sounded like a failing compressor. Ethan looked out the window. The sun was gone, leaving behind a sky the color of a fresh bruise. The case had only just begun, and the chill was already sinking into his bones. The anatomy of a cold murder. In the basement of the Cook County morgue, the air is always thin. It's a place designed for silence, where the only sound is the low-frequency hum of industrial refrigeration and the occasional clink of stainless steel. But tonight, the atmosphere felt different. It was sharp, sterile, and it carried a scent that didn't belong in a morgue, the faint, cloying smell of scorched clay. Detective Ethan Thorne stood behind a glass partition, watching Dr. Harris work, under the high-intensity surgical lights. The body of Leanne Vance looked like a piece of abstract art. The frost had long since melted into a pool of condensation on the steel table. But her skin remained an unnatural, translucent blue. Come look at this, Ethan, Harris said, his eyes never leaving the binocular eyepiece of the digital microscope. Ethan stepped through the airtight door. On the giant monitor above the workstation, a microscopic view of human tissue appeared. It didn't look like meat and blood. It looked like a field of shattered glass. The human body is mostly water, Harris began, his voice a clinical drone. When you drop someone's core temperature this fast and this deep, physics takes over. The water inside the cells crystallizes into microscopic ice shards. They don't just freeze the cell, they puncture it from the inside out. Ethan stared at the screen. The cell membranes were jagged, shredded like paper in a blender. She was destroyed at a molecular level. Harris continued, long before her heart actually stopped. Her body was literally tearing itself apart from the inside. He didn't need a knife. He turned her own biology into a weapon. Ethan pulled a cigarette from his pocket, rolling it between his fingers. He knew the rules. No smoking in the lab, but he needed the tactile distraction. So, he's a technician, Ethan muttered. He knows thermodynamics. He's patient. And he's sadistic, Harris added, moving to a separate tray. The toxicology report just came back. He didn't knock her out. He used a low-dose sedative, just enough to induce muscle paralysis. But not enough to dull the senses. Ethan, she was conscious for most of it. She felt every cell in her body crystallize. She felt herself turning into a statue. Ethan's jaw tightened. He'd seen plenty of ways to die in this city. Bullets, blades, blunt force. Those were impulsive. Messy. This was a ritual. This was a man trying to play God with a thermometer. Harris picked up the terracotta cicada from the evidence bag. He placed it under a specialized scanner. On the screen, a 3D cross-section of the artifact appeared. You told me it was warm at the scene, Harris said. You weren't imagining things. He pointed to a hair-thin line running along the insect's abdomen. To the naked eye, it was invisible. Under the scanner, it was a seam. The cicada isn't solid clay. It's hollowed out with surgical precision. Inside, there was a chemical heat core, similar to the ones used in tactical hand warmers. It was designed to maintain a temperature of exactly 98 degrees for 6 hours. The exact temperature of a living human. Ethan felt a wave of nausea. He freezes the girl, then puts a living heart back in her hand. It's more than that, Harris whispered. It's a message. He's telling us that he owns the seasons. He can bring winter to July, and he can keep a piece of summer alive in a dead hand. He's not just killing people, Ethan. He's staging a play. Ethan looked at the symbol etched on the cicada's belly again. Those 3 jagged lines. He walked over to his satchel and pulled out a grainy, black and white photo from 2021. It was a picture of a refrigerated transport truck found in an abandoned shipyard. Inside that truck, a young girl had died of hypothermia. Ethan had arrived 17 minutes after her heart stopped. He had spent 5 years trying to find the man who locked that door. Now, the cold had come back for him. He's counting down, isn't he? Harris asked. Ethan didn't answer. He didn't have to. His phone began to vibrate on the metal table, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the silent room. It was Claire. Ethan. Her voice was frantic, breathless. We've got another one. National Aquatic Center. The Olympic-sized pool. The pool is open to the public. Claire, Ethan said, already heading for the door. There are hundreds of people there. Not this pool, she replied. The private training tank in the basement. It's, God, Ethan, it's worse than the last one. The National Aquatic Center was a tomb of concrete and chlorine. When Ethan arrived, the sun was a dying orange ember on the horizon. But the heat was still a physical weight. The humidity in the pool area was nearly 100%. Usually, the air here was thick with the smell of pool chemicals and the echoing splashes of athletes. Now, there was only the sound of a heavy industrial fan and the dripping of water. The victim was Tyson Reed, a 22-year-old Olympic hopeful. He was found at the bottom of the drained diving well. He wasn't wearing a suit, just his competition trunks. Ethan climbed down the ladder into the deep end. The transition was jarring. One moment he was in the sweltering heat of the arena, the next, he stepped into a pocket of air so cold his breath hitched. Tyson lay curled in a fetal position on the white tiles. His skin was a deep, bruised purple, covered in a layer of hoarfrost that was thicker than the last victim's. It looked like someone had dumped a ton of dry ice into the pool and let the boy simmer in it. Ethan knelt beside him. Unlike Leanne, Tyson's face wasn't peaceful. His eyes were wide, frozen in a scream of pure, unadulterated terror. His muscles were locked in a violent spasm, a sign that he had fought against the cold until his very tendons snapped. Ethan looked at the boy's left hand. The fingers were clamped shut so tight the fingernails had dug into the frozen palms. Ethan used a small pry bar from his kit to ease the hand open. A second clay cicada. Ethan picked it up. He expected the warmth. He expected the heartbeat. But this one was different. This one was black, not the terracotta red of the first, but a dark, basalt-colored clay, and it was cold, so cold that Ethan's glove stuck to the surface for a split second. He flipped it over. There, on the belly, was another etching. Ethan pulled out his phone and pulled up the photo of the first symbol. He held them side by side. The first symbol was a set of lines leaning left. The second leaned right. "They're pieces," Ethan whispered. Harris, who had just arrived at the edge of the pool, looked down. "Pieces of what?" Ethan took a photo of the two symbols and used a basic photo editing app to overlay them. His hands shook slightly as the two fragments merged into one coherent image. It was a coffin with a lid that was slightly ajar. "He's not just staging a play, Doc," Ethan said, looking up at the empty, dark stands of the stadium. "He's building a tomb, and he's showing us exactly how much space is left inside." The heat of the stadium seemed to vanish, replaced by a dread so deep it felt like ice in Ethan's veins. The killer wasn't hiding. He was inviting Ethan to watch as the lid finally closed. The hunt for the killer takes a chilling personal turn as Ethan tracks down the source of the clay cicadas and discovers he isn't just investigating a crime. He's the lead character in a sick, 5-year-old script. Fractured souls. The heat didn't break, it just settled. By the third day after Leanne Vance was found, the city felt like it was being held under a magnifying glass. The evening news droned on about a record-breaking heatwave, but for the major crimes unit, the real heat was coming from the stack of files growing on Ethan's desk. The connection was buried deep, but it was there. 3 months ago, a boutique craft fair called Summer and Resurgence had taken place in an old converted warehouse downtown. Both Leanne Vance and Tyson Reed had been there. And so had the man who made the cicadas. His name was Julian Blackwood, a master ceramicist whose work was known for being hauntingly lifelike. Julian's studio was tucked away in a narrow alley on the edge of the industrial district. A place where the brick walls were stained with soot and the air smelled of wet earth and ancient dust. The alley was so quiet that Ethan's boots on the cracked concrete sounded like gunshots. Inside the yard, a few pottery wheels were spinning low, emitting a rhythmic whirring, a monotonous, hypnotic sound like a machine that forgot how to sleep. Ethan stood at the door for a heartbeat, hand hovering over his holster, before stepping into the gloom. The light inside was gray and stagnant. Dust motes danced in the pale shafts of sun filtered through grime-covered windows. On the wooden shelves, hundreds of terracotta cicadas were lined up in perfect, military rows. Some were glazed a brilliant, oily brown, others were raw clay. Their bellies hollowed out, their wings so thin they looked like they would shatter if you breathed on them too hard. Ethan didn't say a word. He walked slowly past the shelves, his eyes scanning the workspace. On a side table, he saw the tools of the trade, small scalpels for hollowing out the clay, thin metal tubes, packets of chemical desiccant, and unlabeled powders. In the corner sat a tray of 3 small heating cores, the exact same model Dr. Harris had found inside the first victim's hand. Beside them was the stamp used to etch the geometric symbol. Ethan stopped. This was it. It wasn't a theory anymore. Julian Blackwood didn't just make cicadas. He made the instruments of death. A few feet away, a wooden partition was covered in newspaper clippings and Polaroids. A photo of Leanne Vance on her opening night. A photo of Tyson Reed on the podium with a gold medal. And a photo of a pair of female hands resting on piano keys. The name printed in the corner was Lydia Vance. A concert program for the Solis Music Hall was pinned next to it, circled in a thick, bleeding red ink. Beside it sat a cicada that wasn't finished yet. The final segment of the symbol had just been carved into its belly. In the center of the room, Julian Blackwood sat at his wheel. His long, skeletal fingers were wrapped around a spinning lump of gray clay. He didn't look up. He didn't act surprised. It was as if he had been expecting Ethan for a lifetime. Cicadas live underground for years, Julian said, his voice thin and dry. Like parchment, they wait in the dark, in the cold. Only when they crawl into the light do they truly have a summer. They have a song. They have a shape. They have beauty. Ethan stood perfectly still, his shadow long across the floor. And then? Julian's lips twitched into a ghost of a smile, but his eyes remained hollow. And then comes what people call nature. They grow old, they wither, they lose their value, they rot. Ethan stepped closer, his voice dropping to a dangerous, low vibrato. The cicada in Leanne's hand had a heat core. The symbol matches your stamps. Your wall is a trophy case for dead people. He leaned over the wheel, forcing Julian to look him in the eye. I'm not here for a lecture on aesthetics. I'm here to ask, who taught you to turn murder into a ritual? The wheel slowed, then stopped. Julian pulled his hands away from the clay. His fingertips stained a muddy brown. He looked up, and Ethan saw a man who hadn't slept in a month. His eyes were sunken, his skin sallow. This wasn't the face of a killer enjoying his work. It was the face of a man who was haunted. I shaped the clay, Julian whispered, but someone else shaped the rest. Who? Julian looked at the rows of cicadas on the shelves, clinging to them as if they were his only tether to reality. He told me I was helping time do a job it wasn't kind enough to do itself. He said if you love something, you don't let it decay in front of you. By killing them? Julian blinked slowly. You call it killing. I call it preservation. Ethan felt the heat in his chest rising. A slow boiling rage. Leanne was supposed to have dinner with her mother. Tyson had a whole season ahead of him. They weren't statues for you to put in a box. Julian. You think being alive is always better? Julian snapped, his voice suddenly sharp. Do you know how people look at a dancer when her knees lose their spring? Do you know what they call an athlete who's past his prime after one bad race? I've seen that look. That look is the real knife. Ethan didn't flinch. Those aren't your words. Someone put those thoughts in your head. Julian let out a short, dry laugh. Does it matter? It matters. Ethan growled. Because you're the one holding the ice. You're the one choosing to do this. Silence fell over the studio. Outside, the real cicadas began their rhythmic screaming again. In the heavy, humid air, Julian tilted his head as if listening to a voice only he could hear. He said someone would eventually understand me. Julian muttered, someone who knows what it feels like to be exactly one beat too late. Ethan froze. The air in the room suddenly felt sub-zero. What did you just say? Julian didn't look at him. His gaze shifted to a corner of the wall behind Ethan. Ethan spun around. There, tucked away among the clippings, was a photo taken from a distance. It showed a man leaning against a hospital balcony. His clothes were wrinkled, his face a mask of total, soul-crushing exhaustion. Even though the photo was grainy, Ethan recognized himself instantly. It was from 5 years ago, the night the girl in the refrigerated truck died. Pinned to the photo was a typed note, tucked into the shell of a massive, unglazed cicada. Solis Hall, 2030. Don't be late. Beneath the text was the final version of the symbol. It wasn't fragmented anymore. The lines were joined, forming a perfectly rendered, closed coffin. Ethan's throat went dry. It wasn't the threat that chilled him, it was the realization. This person hadn't just been watching the victims. They had been watching him. They had been there 5 years ago, standing close enough to see him break. Ethan ripped the note off the wall, crumpling the edges. Who took this? Julian shrank back, his shoulders bunching up. I don't know. Who gave it to you? He doesn't leave a name. Sometimes he meets me here. Sometimes he just leaves things at the door. Julian swallowed hard, his eyes darting toward the shadows. He knows what to say. He knows exactly which strings to pull. Ethan lunged forward, grabbing Julian by the collar and hauling him out of his chair. The wooden stool clattered to the floor. Where is Lydia Vance? Julian looked at him, and for the first time, Ethan saw a flicker of pity in the man's eyes. I'm not holding her, Julian wheezed. My part is done. What part? The scout, the craftsman, the one who makes the final cicada. Julian closed his eyes. He said she was perfect for the piano. Perfect for Solis. A place where the sound dies the moment it's born. Ethan threw him back into the chair. He looked at his watch. 20:07. The blood drained from his face and then hammered back into his temples. He knew this feeling. The feeling of the clock shrinking. The feeling of death being one step ahead. He turned and bolted for the door. Behind him, Julian's voice drifted through the studio. barely audible over the whirring of the wheels. He doesn't want to kill her before you get there, Ethan. He wants you to arrive, just late enough. Ethan didn't look back. He threw himself into his car and slammed it into gear. The target was clear. Lydia Vance. Solis Music Hall, 2030. But this time, it wasn't just a victim on the line. The killer had reached into the deepest, darkest part of Ethan's soul, the 17 minutes of failure he had lived with for 5 years. And if the doors to Solis Hall closed before he got there, the next person to die wouldn't just be Lydia. It would be whatever was left of Ethan Thorne. The countdown is narrowing, as Ethan Thorne moves from the lead investigator to the primary target. The suspense transitions into a high-stakes psychological game. Here is part 4, focusing on the infiltration of Solis Hall and the first confrontation with the mastermind. The Phantom of Solis Hall. The city didn't care about the countdown. As Ethan Thorne's sedan tore through the downtown grid, the neon lights of strip malls and billboards blurred into jagged, electric streaks against the humid night. The air conditioning in the car was screaming, struggling to push back the 100-degree heat outside. But Ethan's hands were clammy. He gripped the steering wheel so hard his knuckles turned white. His eyes locked on the red numbers of the digital clock on his dash. 2018, 12 minutes. Every red light felt like a personal insult. Every brake light in front of him was a heartbeat lost. In his mind, he wasn't driving through a modern metropolis. He was running through a graveyard of his own failures. 17 minutes. The ghost of that number lived in the backseat, mocking him. 5 years ago, a refrigerated truck had become a child's tomb because Ethan had been 17 minutes slow. He wouldn't let the clock win again. Not tonight, not with Lydia Vance. Solis Music Hall loomed at the end of the boulevard like a cathedral of cold stone. It was a massive, neoclassical fortress of gray granite and French arches, its windows dark and uninviting. Tonight was a closed dress rehearsal, and the plaza in front of the hall was a desert of concrete, bathed in the sickly yellow glow of high-pressure sodium lamps. Ethan slammed his car into the curb, the tires screeching against the stone. He didn't wait for the engine to cool. He vaulted out of the car, his service weapon heavy at his hip, and ran for the main entrance. A security guard stepped out of the shadows of the lobby, hand raised. "Sir, the hall is closed to the..." Ethan didn't stop. He shoved his badge into the man's face, his voice a jagged rasp. "Major crimes. There's a lethal threat in the auditorium. Call 911. Get paramedics here now. Evacuate the backstage staff, but keep the stage lights on. Do it now." He left the guard stammering and sprinted into the main foyer. The lobby was a cavern of silent marble and velvet. The air unnaturally cool, not the sterile cold of a morgue, but the heavy, stagnant chill of a building waiting for an audience that would never come. Ethan reached the heavy oak doors of the main hall. He paused for a fraction of a second, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. Then, he heard it. It wasn't a symphony. It was a piano, notes that were fractured, trembling, and hauntingly off-key. It sounded like someone was trying to play a lullaby while their fingers were being snapped. He pushed the doors open. The auditorium was a sea of darkness. Thousands of empty red velvet seats stretched out like a silent army. But the stage was a blinding island of white light. Lydia Vance sat at the 9-foot Steinway grand piano. From this distance, she looked like a porcelain doll. Her back was ramrod straight, the ingrained discipline of a world-class artist, but her shoulders were shaking. She was draped in a black evening gown, her pale skin glistening under the spotlights. But it was the air around her that stopped Ethan in his tracks. A thick, swirling mist of frost was cascading off the stage, rolling into the front row of the orchestra pit like dry ice. It wasn't an effect. 4 industrial-grade cooling units, hidden behind bouquets of white lilies, were roaring with a muffled, mechanical hum. They were blasting plumes of sub-zero air directly at her. Lydia's hands moved across the keys, but they were sluggish, purple with cold. Every breath she took emerged as a puff of white vapor. She was being flash-frozen in the middle of her own performance. "Lydia," Ethan's voice echoed through the vast space. She flinched, her hands crashing down on the keys in a jarring, Dissonant chord that sounded like a scream. She didn't turn her head. She couldn't. Her neck was already beginning to lock. "Stay where you are, Ethan." The voice didn't come from the stage. It came from the darkness of the 10th row. Ethan spun around, his hand dropping to the bang of his pistol. He squinted into the gloom. A man was standing in the center aisle, perfectly composed. He wore a crisp, white linen suit and thin, latex medical gloves. In the dim light, his face was a blur of shadows, but his posture was one of absolute, terrifying calm. "You hear that?" the man asked, his voice smooth and cultured, as if they were discussing fine wine. "The note from a piano is the cruelest thing in the world. It is most beautiful at the exact moment it vanishes. I'm simply helping her hold onto that beauty, forever. Turn off the machines, you sick bastard." Ethan lowered his center of gravity, his eyes darting across the stage, looking for the control hub. The man in white let out a soft, dry chuckle, the sound of a cicada's wings. "You call it murder, I call it a mercy. I am saving her from the mundane, from the inevitable decay of a career that has already peaked. Look at her, Ethan. In 10 years, she'll be a teacher in a drafty basement. Forgotten. Tonight, she is a masterpiece of ice." Lydia let out a whimpering sob. Her fingertips were turning a dark, necrotic blue. If the machines kept running, the cold would destroy the nerves in her hands within minutes. She would never play again, if she lived at all. "You want me to watch her break?" Ethan said, his voice dropping into a lethal, low register. "This is about 5 years ago. This is about the truck." The man in white tilted his head. The movement was predatory. "There are some things, detective, where being 1 beat late means you lose everything. I wanted to see if you've learned how to dance with the clock." The killer stepped back into the deeper shadows of the balcony overhang. He wasn't fleeing. He was retreating into the wings of his own theater, leaving Ethan with a choice that was as sharp as a razor. Ethan looked at the stage. The LED timer on the cooling units was pulsing a frantic red. He could chase the shadow into the labyrinth of the theater, or he could save the girl. He didn't hesitate. He turned his back on the killer and sprinted for the stage. Behind him, the man's voice floated through the dark one last time. "The lid is closing. Ethan, don't fumble the keys. This is the final chapter of the season. The stakes are at their absolute peak, resolving the immediate threat to Lydia Vance while setting the stage for a much larger, darker conspiracy." The summer's final note. The city outside was a blurred smear of neon and asphalt. Ethan Thorne drove his sedan like a man possessed, weaving through the thick evening traffic of the metropolis like a wounded predator hunting for its own life. The heat index was still hovering near 100 degrees. The humidity so thick it felt like driving through a wet wool blanket. But inside the car, Ethan's hands were slick with cold sweat, sliding against the leather of the steering wheel. The scrap of paper from Julian's studio sat on the passenger seat. A death warrant in plain text. Solis Hall, 2030. Don't be late. His eyes flicked to the dashboard clock. 2019, 11 minutes. Ethan slammed his palm against the wheel, a silent snarl escaping his lips. He didn't allow himself to think about the red lights or the gridlock. He couldn't, because if he did, the number would come back. 17 minutes. 5 years ago. That was the gap. 17 minutes between a frantic call and a cold body in a steel truck. This time, the killer wasn't just after a victim. He was after Ethan's sanity. He wanted Ethan to arrive just in time to watch the light go out of Lydia's eyes. Solis Music Hall rose at the end of the Grand Boulevard, a monolith of gray granite and neoclassical arches that looked like a tomb for the arts. The plaza in front was empty, the fountains dry, the air heavy with the scent of hot stone and old exhaust. Tonight was a private rehearsal. The doors should have been locked. Ethan didn't wait. He jumped the curb, the sedan's underside scraping with a shower of sparks. He was out of the door before the engine even died. A security guard in the lobby stepped forward, his mouth opening to protest. But Ethan shoved his badge into the man's face with a violence that shocked them both. "Major crimes. There's an active threat in the auditorium," Ethan barked, his voice echoing off the marble walls. "Call for backup. Get paramedics here now. Evacuate the backstage." But for the love of God, keep the stage lights on. Go. He didn't wait for a response. He sprinted toward the main hall, his boots thundering on the carpeted floors. As he pushed through the heavy mahogany doors, the sudden transition was jarring. The lobby was sweltering, but the auditorium was a cavern of unnatural, artificial chill. Then, he heard it. It wasn't music, it was a struggle. The piano notes were jagged, dissonant, and fragile, like the sound of porcelain shattering on a frozen lake. Ethan moved down the center aisle, his hand on his service weapon, his eyes locked on the stage. Lydia Vance was there, bathed in a white-hot spotlight. She sat at the 9-foot Steinway, her back straight, her hands moving across the keys in a sluggish, agonizing rhythm. Every breath she drew emerged from her lips as a plume of white frost. Image. A wide-angle shot of a grand, darkened music hall. A single spotlight shines on a female pianist on stage, who is being enveloped in a thick, crystalline mist of ice as she plays. In the dark aisles of the theater, Detective Ethan Thorne is running toward her. The stage was an icebox. Hidden behind towering arrangements of white lilies were 4 industrial-grade cooling units, their black hoses snaking across the floor like vipers. They were pumping sub-zero air directly into the space around the piano. A fine layer of hoarfrost had already begun to coat the polished wood of the Steinway and the delicate skin of Lydia's bare shoulders. "Lydia!" Ethan roared. The music broke. Lydia flinched, her head turning slowly, her eyes wide with a glazed, hypnotic terror. She tried to speak, but her lips were a bruised purple, frozen into a silent plea. "Stay right there, Ethan." The voice was calm, cultured, and utterly devoid of humanity. It came from the shadows of the mezzanine. Ethan spun, his gun leveled at a figure standing near the edge of the balcony. A man in a crisp white suit, his face obscured by the angle of the light, watching the scene like a conductor overseeing his finest work. "Do you hear the timbre?" the man asked. "The piano sounds different when the wood is at the point of cracking. It's a unique resonance. I'm giving her the gift of a permanent crescendo." "Turn them off," Ethan shouted, his eyes darting to the cooling units. He could see the control hub near the base of the piano. The LED display was counting down. "You think this is about her?" the man in white said, his voice drifting down like falling snow. "But it's always been about the clock, hasn't it? You're wondering if you're 17 minutes late again. You're wondering if, this time, you'll have to watch her turn to stone while you stand there powerless." Lydia's hands slipped from the keys, her fingers curling into stiff, useless claws. She was slipping into the final stages of hypothermia. Ethan had a choice. He could chase the shadow into the labyrinth of the theater, or he could save the girl. He didn't hesitate. He holstered his weapon and charged the stage. The man in white didn't move to stop him. He simply stepped back into the darkness of the mezzanine, disappearing like a ghost. He had already won the psychological war. Now he just wanted to watch the fallout. Ethan scrambled onto the stage, the air so cold it burned his lungs. He knelt by the primary cooling unit, his mind racing through the technical specs Julian had mentioned. "Don't just pull the plug," he told himself. "The pressure will spike, the hoses will burst, the liquid nitrogen will spray her." He ripped open the access panel with his bare hands, the frozen metal tearing the skin on his fingertips. Cut the compressor load first, then the auxiliary power. Avoid the valve lock. His fingers were going numb, losing the fine motor skills he needed. He could hear Lydia's breathing, shallow, wet, and rattling. "Stay with me, Lydia," he grunted, his teeth chattering. "Look at me." He found the relay. With a desperate yank, he tore the main fuse from its housing. The machine let out a dying groan, the fans slowing to a halt. He lunged for the second, then the third. One by one, the roar of the cooling units faded into a deafening silence. The mist began to dissipate. Ethan grabbed his coat and threw it over Lydia, pulling her into his arms. Her skin felt like a block of ice, her pulse a thready, desperate flutter against his neck. "My hands," she whispered, her voice a ghost of a sound. "Ethan, can I still play?" Ethan gripped her hands through the fabric of his coat, rubbing them with a fierce, protective desperation. "You're okay. You're going to be fine." Do you hear me? I'm here. I'm not late. Lydia didn't smile, but she leaned into him, her eyes closing as the warmth of his body began to fight back the winter. As the paramedics flooded into the hall, their flashlights cutting through the gloom, Ethan looked down at the piano's music stand. Tucked behind the score of Chopin's Nocturnes was a final gift. The third clay cicada. Ethan picked it up with a gloved hand. It was black, cold, and heavy as a heart made of lead. He turned it over. The symbol on the belly was complete now. It was a coffin. The lid slammed shut and sealed with a jagged, etched line. Beneath the symbol, a single sentence was written in a cramped, elegant hand. You saved a note. Let's see if you can survive the rest of the song. At the bottom of the note was a small, hand-drawn image. A pair of cicada wings, torn off and bleeding. Ethan stood on the stage, the July heat finally beginning to creep back into the building. But the warmth didn't reach him. He looked out into the empty, dark auditorium. The man in white was gone. But the message was clear. This wasn't the end of the case. It was the end of the overture. The summer of death was only just beginning, and the conductor was still holding the baton. Ethan held Lydia as the warmth finally returned to the hall. But the black clay cicada in his hand whispered a different truth. The coffin is closed, but the song has only just begun. If you're ready to follow Detective Thorne deeper into this frost-covered nightmare, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. What do you think the man in white is really planning? Tell me your theories in the comments. I'll see you in the next chapter.